Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Sackett-Taylor, and this is a video lecture for my course in Principles of Microeconomics. And today I want to talk to you about elasticity. In the last chapter we covered, chapter 3, we looked at the supply and demand model and how supply and demand together balance the desires of the consumers and producers in a market. Demand and supply will drive prices towards equilibrium, the place where demand and supply are equal, or the place where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect in the graph that we see. We learned that the direction of these changes in quantity, or in other words, the direction of the slope of each curve, is related to the law of demand and the law of supply, which is really just a description of human behavior. We know that the law of demand tells us that prices and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. That is, when prices go up, we tend to demand less of that good. And when the price of a good goes down, we demand more of it. On the other hand, if we're the producer of that good, when the price we sell our product for goes up, we're incentivized to supply more of it. And when the price goes down, we're incentivized to sell less of it. In this chapter, we're going to take this a step further, and we're going to try to use elasticity as a concept to help us understand the sensitivity of consumers to those price changes. So when we talk about the price of something going up or going down, we're really interested in not just the direction that the quantity demanded goes into. For example, when prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. But we want to know the magnitude. So if prices go up by 10%, does demand go down by 10%? Does it go down by more than 10% or less than 10%? Elasticity helps us answer these kinds of sensitivity questions where we can actually measure the size or the magnitude of the shift when we see price changes in a given market. So the questions we're going to answer in today's lecture, there's a couple different elasticities we're going to look at. So the first is the price elasticity of demand. And we want to understand not just how to calculate this, but also what are the determinants? What drives something being highly elastic or highly inelastic? We also want to know how changes in income and the price of other goods can affect elasticities, because we know that these are demand shifters or factors. On the supply side of the market, we'll look at the definition, how to calculate, and some examples of price elasticity of supply. And we'll be interested in knowing how the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply relate to one another. So here's a question for you, just to kind of situate yourself inside of the economic context that we're going to set up to understand this concept. So if gasoline prices were to go up by 10%, my question to you is, do you decrease your demand for gasoline by 10%, by more than 10%, by less than 10%? Well, maybe it helps if I put this into relative terms. Consider now if instead of talking about gasoline, we were talking about the price of a Big Mac. If the Big Mac meal had prices go up by 10%, do you think that your decrease in demand would be larger or smaller relative to your decrease in demand as the result of gasoline prices going up by 10%? In other words, I'm asking you which you would be more sensitive to. Which one are you likely to respond to in a larger magnitude? For me, I'm pretty sure that I would be more sensitive to the price of a Big Mac changing rather than the price of gasoline changing, because I can always choose to eat something or buy something other than a Big Mac, but there's not many other options for ways that I can get to work. I have to put gasoline in my car. So I'm likely to change my behavior less as a result of a change to the price of gasoline than I am to change my behavior when I see the price of a Big Mac meal go up. So this brings us to defining the concept of price elasticity of demand. Elasticity is a measure of responsiveness of the buyers and the sellers in the market to a change in a price variable, like prices of the good itself or potentially on the consumer side, your income. We already know these words, they're in our English vernacular, but we've used them slightly differently. I have something to demonstrate this for you here. I have two rubber bands. Here's the first rubber band. When I pull on it, it's actually quite hard to stretch. But when I compare this rubber band to this skinnier rubber band, and I pull on the skinny rubber band, I'm able to stretch it much further. So we would describe this skinnier rubber band that stretched further as being more elastic than the fatter rubber band that didn't stretch as far. This should feel familiar to you to describe a rubber band like this as more elastic than the other. Well, similarly, we would say that the consumer response to a change in prices is more elastic when that response is bigger, when we decrease our demand by a larger magnitude, in other words. This is useful because when price and income changes, we can now determine how much the buyer and seller actually change their behavior, not just which direction. So price elasticity of demand is the measure of responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. So in general, when we define these concepts, the first word, price, here, price elasticity of demand. There's three words there. The first word is price. That tells us that that's the thing that's changing. The last word is demand. That tells us that's the thing responding. So the first word is always the thing changing. The third word is always the thing responding. So we want to know, by measuring price elasticity of demand, how much demand responds to a change in price. In other words, how big or what is the size of that response? This is a sensitivity measure of the relationship between these two variables. We say that demand is more elastic if the quantity demanded changes significantly as the result of a price change. Elastic, you can think of as meaning moving a lot or stretching really far. This means we're really responsive and really sensitive to changes in price. However, when demand is inelastic, or it doesn't stretch very far, it doesn't move very much, this is a situation where the quantity demanded response is relatively small as the result of a price change. So we can think of inelastic as being insensitive to prices or not very responsive. So what makes something more elastic or less elastic? Well, luckily we have a few rules that we know tend to align with human behavior. We tend to have very elastic demand when a good has lots of substitutes. Because if something has lots of substitutes, it means that we have lots of other options to consider when the price of something changes. So for example, cantaloupe is something with lots of substitutes. I would say that on a given week when I'm grocery shopping, I would be very happy to replace the cantaloupe with another kind of melon or even a different kind of fruit, right? There's lots of fruit varieties available to me most weeks at the grocery store. So if the price of cantaloupe went up, I would just substitute away from it and choose to buy something else instead. In other words, there would be a pretty significant response on behalf of the buyer as a result of that price change. However, things that have few substitutes, like light bulbs or gasoline, tend to be relatively inelastic. And that's because we don't have so many options, and therefore we don't have as many opportunities to change our behavior and purchase other things instead. So when the price of gasoline goes up or when the price of light bulbs go up, I probably continue to consume a similar amount of each of those goods going forward, in that I'm not very responsive to the change in price. The second thing that can affect whether something is very elastic or very inelastic is the share of your budget that you spend on that good. Big ticket items like cars and houses make up a large portion of my total income. And therefore, I'm going to be pretty sensitive to changes in the price of those items. And remember, sensitive means elastic, right? I'm going to change my behavior as a lot in response to a change in prices in those markets. However, inexpensive items like candy or pens, something that doesn't take up very much of my overall income, I'm probably going to be inelastic on those items, in that I'd be less responsive to price changes because I don't feel those price changes as significantly when I'm thinking about my overall budget. We can also break down elasticity by whether an item is a necessity or a luxury. Things that are luxuries, we tend to spend our additional money on, right? The extra that we're left over with after we've paid all our bills. And so when we're thinking about those extra dollars that maybe we've saved really hard for, we're going to be really considering all of the possible options for the ways that we could spend that money. So do I want that shiny new car, or that brand new piece of jewelry, or that designer handbag? Right? I'm going to weigh these options carefully, and therefore I'm going to be pretty responsive to changes in the price of those items, right? I'm going to be sensitive to how much those things cost, often because it's a large portion of my budget. Necessities, however, are things that they may actually be a large portion of my budget, but I can't live without them, like housing or food or healthcare. When the price of these things change, I feel it a lot, but I actually don't have many other options available to me. So necessities tend to be inelastic. We keep buying roughly the same amount, even as prices fluctuate. Finally, we can also look at the market as a whole to determine whether we've defined that market very broadly or very narrowly. The more narrowly defined, the more elastic the market. Whereas when we define things broadly, they tend to fall into these categories where they have very few substitutes. So what I'm talking about here, for example, would be like, I may be very sensitive or elastic to the price of Netflix changing month to month, because Netflix I've defined pretty narrowly. It's like one specific streaming service. Whereas if I was to say the price of all streaming services, so that would include my Netflix account, my Hulu account, my Disney Plus account, my ESPN account, all of those things, if the price of those things all went up, well, my demand for them will probably be less elastic, maybe even inelastic, in that I'm not going to really change my behavior in terms of the overall number of streaming services that I really need and want based on my own preferences for what I watch. So the more narrowly or more specific you are about a market, the more elastically we respond to prices changing in that market. Whereas when a market is really defined very, very broadly, all of a sudden we have fewer substitutes and fewer options, and we're not going to change our behavior that much as the result of a price change. Last but not least, we can talk about time. And this really, it comes directly out of a psychology argument, right? That the longer time horizon, the longer we have to consider our options and look for alternatives, the more likely we are to change our behavior. So that means that in the long time horizon, things tend to be more elastic than in a short-term horizon where I don't have many choices to change my behavior. So for example, let's think about the price of gasoline. In the short run, my demand for gasoline is inelastic, meaning that as the price of gasoline goes up, I still have to fill my tank. I still have to drive to Westfield every day, right? I still have to do these things, and I don't have many options in the short run in order to change my behavior. So my demand, is not going to change much as a result of prices going up. However, if I see over time, which is true, that gasoline prices have an upward trajectory, I could make bigger changes that require more time to make. For example, I could buy a hybrid vehicle and actually change my vehicle that I use to commute. I could become part of a kind of co-commuting community where we car share on our way in so that I'm driving fewer times per week. I mean, if I wanted to take it to the extreme, I could even sell my house and move closer to Westfield, right? And so these are all things that take a lot of time. So your behavior change is more likely to happen in the long-term horizon, elastic demand, than it is in the short-term horizon, inelastic demand. So let's practice what we know. In terms of price elasticity of demand, which of the following goods is probably the least elastic or most inelastic? Well, let's think about these things. A new house is a big ticket purchase, right? That's going to take up a large portion of my income. So we know that things that take up a huge portion of our budget tend to be very elastic. We're sensitive to those. So it's not going to be the new house. A very specific brand of breakfast cereal is a narrowly defined market, right? And we said that the narrower you define something, really the more comparative options and substitutes you have. And so that's also very elastic. So it's not breakfast cereal. A new vehicle is a luxury item, right? If we're talking new and not used, I actually personally have never bought a brand new car in my entire life. This is a luxury item and is going to cost more. And so I'm going to be really careful about making those kind of financial decisions. And so therefore, I'll be very responsive to price changes, also very elastic. So the only thing that would be really inelastic in this point would be the necessity, which is the electricity to power your home. The next part of this lecture gets a little bit mathematical, and you'll want to have a calculator handy. You can use your phone calculator just fine. All you need to be able to do here is add, oh, it doesn't even look at the screen on my phone. That's interesting. Is add, subtract, divide, and multiply. Okay, so the first thing I have to say here is mathematicians use symbols often to represent words, just so that they can say things in fewer words. So this symbol that looks like a triangle is a capital delta. And mathematicians and economists use this to mean change. So when you see a delta, you can think like a change in something. So the price elasticity of demand, which we'll call big E, little d for elasticity of demand, is going to be equal to the percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. So it's always the response variable up at the top of the fraction and the changing variable in the bottom of the fraction. So prices are changing, demand is responding. So mathematically, we represent this here as the percent delta, meaning change, percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. So let's do an example. A university parking pass increases in price by 50%. As a result, 25% fewer people purchase a parking pass. This should be expected, law of demand. Parking passes got more expensive, fewer people buy them. So what is the price elasticity of demand in this context? We can plug these numbers into this formula. So we put the percent change in price, which is a positive 50% change on the bottom, and then the percent change in our demand, which was a decrease represented by the negative sign here of 25%. And when we divide 25 divided by 50, we get 1/2. And this overall, a negative divided by a positive, is going to be a negative effect. This tells us that in general, the response is going to be half the size of the initial change, and that it's in the negative direction. So when prices increase by a certain amount, demand will decrease by half that amount. What does the number really mean? Well, if the price was to go up by 1%, we would know that demand would go down by 0.5%. In this case, when the price elasticity is negative 0.5, it tells us, first of all, the direction. Prices go up, demand goes down. And it tells us the size relative to one another. So if prices had gone up 30%, we know that demand will go down 15%, right? 1/2, because that's the elasticity. This is not very price elastic. In general, we say that elasticity numbers that fall between 0 and 1 tend to be inelastic, meaning that the response is smaller than the initial change itself. And it's negative because of the law of demand. Prices and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. So let's practice this. Suppose that the price of candy bars increases by 100%, meaning it doubles. As a result, you decide to purchase 50% fewer candy bars. How would you describe your demand for candy bars? Well, here, demand is inelastic because my response is smaller than the initial change, right? The initial change was a 100% increase. And since my response was less than 100% decrease, that means I have inelastic demand, meaning I'm less responsive to that price change. And this is where we would call this demand inelastic. It helps us, though, when we don't have percentages outright and we have to calculate them, to use what's called the midpoint method. One issue with using just percentages is that it's actually hard to pin down what the percent change is because it depends on where you start. Here's an example for you. If we were looking at a price decrease from $100 down to $80, that's actually a 20% decrease in price. But if we were to have started at $80 and look at an increase to $100, that's actually a 25% increase in price. Even though both of them is only a $20 change, $20 out of 100 is 20%, whereas $20 out of 80 is 25%. So this is really confusing. And we would get different answers depending on whether we were looking at the starting point as being the higher price or the lower price. So the way that we get rid of this complication is by using a method to calculate percentages called the midpoint method. The midpoint method corrects for this problem by taking averages. So when we look at the percent change in things, we're going to calculate the percent change as the overall numerical change divided by the average of the two numbers. Excuse me. Let me give you an example. This is where having a calculator would be really handy. So let's say that the old price was $6. And at this price, 15 people wanted to buy the product. Now the new price is $4. And at this lower price, more people want to buy this product, 25 people. Let's figure out what the elasticity is using the midpoint method. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at in the numerator here, and we're going to calculate the change in quantity demanded. So first we take the difference between the two numbers. That's 25, which was the new quantity, minus 15, which is the old quantity. That gives us 10. Keep that number in mind. Here, actually, maybe I could write it. That's going to take me too long in a second, but this number is 10. The change in quantity goes from, the new one is 25, the old one's 15, so that number is 10. Now we divide that by the average of these two numbers, the average of 15 and 25. So we add 15 plus 25 and divide by 2. 15 plus 25 is 40, divided by 2 is 20. So 20 is the average between 15 and 25. So we would have 10 divided by 20 in the numerator. Okay, so now let's look at the denominator, the change in price. First, we take the difference between the two price levels. So the new price is $4 minus the old price, which was $6. This gives us a -2. Now we take the average of those two prices. $6 and $4 is 10, averaged is 5. So in the denominator, we have -2 over 5. When we put this into our calculator, we can say 10 divided by 20 is 1/2. That's in the numerator. In the denominator, 2 divided by 5 is negative 0.4. And so we take 0.5 on the top divided by negative 0.4 in the bottom, and we get negative 1.25. This tells us, first, the negative is the direction. When prices went down from 6 to 4, quantity went up, right? So they moved in opposite directions. That's what the negative sign tells us. And 1.25 tells us that this is actually elastic because the number is bigger than 1, which means that the response was bigger than the initial change. That is, that the response in quantity, the size of that shift from 15 to 25 is a larger change in and of itself in response to this price change from 6 to 4. When we graph it, if demand is relatively elastic, it means that we're sensitive to price changes. And so since we measure price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, this means that we're going to have bigger quantity shifts than price shifts, so bigger horizontal shifts, which means that the curve is going to lie kind of flat. Whereas if demand was inelastic, we're really not very sensitive to price changes. That means that since price is on the y-axis and quantity is on the x-axis, we're going to have really small quantity shifts relative to the price shift. So that line is going to be steeper. Let's demonstrate this. Here's quantity on the x, price on the y. We're going to start here with an example where the elasticity is actually equal to 0. This is a situation where there's been a price change, any price change, and there's no quantity change whatsoever, right? So this would be a perfectly vertical demand curve. This is where we're not sensitive to price. In fact, our demand doesn't rely on price at all. And we would say that we are perfectly inelastic in this market, and our elasticity equals 0. If we have small quantity changes in response, meaning that when we compare the two, the price change itself was kind of big, and then the response by buyers in terms of changing their buying behavior was rather small, that means that we're going to have a number that falls somewhere between 0 and 1. And this is where we would call this inelastic, where we have small quantity changes. And so that makes the demand curve pretty steep. Whereas if we were in the opposite situation where relative to one another, that price change was kind of small, but our response to it in terms of our buying behavior was really, really big. We were really sensitive to it. That's going to create large horizontal shifts, which flattens out the demand curve. There is another extreme here, and this is the case where demand is perfectly elastic. And this is a situation where very, very tiny changes in price actually will shift demand by huge amounts. This is an example of perfectly elastic demand where the demand curve is horizontal. So as we can see here, if the demand curve in light blue, D1, is the vertical one, that is the most inelastic, so least sensitive. And then as we tilt that curve so that it gets flatter and flatter, so it goes to D2, then to D3, that's the process of looking at demand as it gets more and more elastic. So I want you to remember, more elastic means flatter curves. Elasticity and the slope of the demand curve are related in this way, but they're not equal. In fact, when we have linear demand curve, although the slope is the same at each point, the elasticity that we call point elasticity is actually different at each point. This is because elasticity is based on percent changes. And so percent changes of large numbers are much bigger than percent changes of small numbers, which are much smaller. Elasticity therefore decreases or gets more and more inelastic as we move along the demand curve. Let me show you this. So here we could calculate changes in prices and changes in quantities to get an actual numerical value of elasticity at each point. If we did this, which is a good exercise, you can see that like a change from $5 to $4, which results in an increase of 1 unit, 1 additional unit will be bought when that price goes from 5 to 4. That change results in elasticity that's negative 9.1. Whereas the change from $4 down to $3 actually increases here by 1 unit, but now because these prices are lower, the relative elasticity is also lower, right? Percentages of small numbers are smaller numbers. And so here the elasticity is negative 2.3. As we move down, we can see we actually fall down below 1. So to the right of the center is inelastic, whereas to the left of center is elastic. And this is just kind of going back to that, like, how much of your budget is it? At higher prices, things are more elastic because they take up more of your budget. At lower prices, things are less elastic because they take up less of your budget. This is where I'm going to stop this video because we really need to feel very solid about how we calculate price elasticity and what it represents before we move on to this next topic, which is using price elasticity to determine as a business how to raise my total revenues. So let's pause here and pick up in the next video with an application of business and our total revenue maximization. All right. See you next time.